Hi everyone. I've come today because I want to talk about modern slavery. I want to talk about what you as business leaders need to know about modern slavery, what it is that leading companies are doing about modern slavery, what they're learning about what's working, and what that means that you can and should be thinking about doing in your companies. So that's what I want to talk about. And the way I want to try and do this, the way I've tried to structure the talk, is I want to do a bit of myth busting. So I've got 6 myths about modern slavery, and I'm going to try and clear up a few misconceptions about what we're talking about. And I'm also going to be drawing on some research we've been doing here at Hult. I'm part of a team of researchers here at Hult. A couple of my colleagues are in the room. We've been working, we've spent a year or so working with a network called the Ethical Trading Initiative, and we worked closely with about 70 companies, talking to them about what they were doing on modern slavery and what they were learning. I've put some of the logos up here on the slide. So, what do you need to know about modern slavery? What are some of the myths we need to clear up? Myth number 1, slavery is something that was eradicated quite a long time ago. I confess that this is an assumption that I held until 2 or 3 years ago. Like most people, I think, slavery is something that's just part of history. And the way in which I encountered modern slavery, the idea of modern slavery, was to do with this film, 12 Years a Slave. And I remember the moment very clearly because the film was up for an Oscar and it had won the Best Picture, and I was in bed the next morning listening to the news on the radio, and they played a clip of the Oscar acceptance speech by the director, Steve McQueen. And he made this comment about dedicating his award to the 21 million people in slavery today. And I was just half awake, lying there in bed, thinking, that was a good film, I remember it. 21 million people in slavery today, what's that about? I don't understand it, it doesn't compute. But afterwards I went away and I Googled it, and it's true, 21 million people in slavery today. Those are the figures from the International Labour Organization, ILO. So the rest of what I've got to say, the other 5 myths I'm going to talk about, are kind of my journey since this moment and hearing about modern slavery for the first time and learning a bit more about it and clearing up my own misconceptions. Myth number 2, modern slavery is just an emotive or a sensationalist way of talking about poor labour standards. We all hear about the stories of people working in factories in East Asia or Central America, maybe making T-shirts, working for $1 a day, long hours, maybe they've got unsafe working conditions, they're suffering discrimination. We're familiar with those stories. And is that what we're talking about when we talk about modern slavery? No, it's not. That's bad stuff, that's terrible, but that's not modern slavery. Modern slavery is literally people who are working in a working situation where they're unfree. They can't escape. Someone's going to hurt them if they try and leave their job. The photo here is of a gentleman called Yum. He's from Cambodia, and his story is that he was very poor, and someone came along, someone he didn't know, and said, well, there's work available in Thailand on a construction site. If you want to go there, I can arrange some transport for you. It's going to cost a lot of money, but we can take the money out of your first month's wages. And so Yum embarked on a journey to Thailand, and when he eventually arrived at his destination, he found it wasn't a construction site, but it was a seaport. And he'd been sold to work as a fisherman on a fishing boat and fish for prawns. And he complained, and he was beaten up, and he was put on the boat, and he spent months on the boat. And the boat was coming and going into ports, but he couldn't get off the boat, and he was beaten up several times. And his story kind of ends happily in that one time the boat was in port in Indonesia, and he managed to sneak off the boat, and he went to the local police, and he eventually made his way home to Cambodia. But these are the kind of stories that people are talking about when they're talking about modern slavery. 21 million people trapped in these kinds of unfree situations in the world today. Modern slavery, myth number 3, modern slavery only happens in faraway places. We're in the UK today for this talk. I'd be interested if anyone has any idea of how many people they think are trapped in modern slavery in the UK today. The British government's own figures are that it's between 10,000 and 13,000 people in this country. I've got a map here. This shows this is based on the ILO research. So this is the 21 million people. This shows the distribution of where those people are in different parts of the world. A little more than half of those people are in Asia. There's around nearly 4 million in Africa, nearly 2 million in Latin America. But if you look at the red areas, they've put developed countries together, so North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, about 1.5 million people trapped in slave labor conditions in these countries as well. So the point is that modern slavery doesn't just happen in faraway places. Wherever you are, the chances are that there's someone close to you trapped in the slave labor conditions right under your nose. Myth number 4, modern slavery isn't something that affects my company. You might be starting to think now, and following me on my journey into modern slavery, that, wow, okay, modern slavery is a big deal, and it's a big problem, and it's happening in a lot of places, but it's probably not happening in my company. It's true to say that there are particularly high-risk pockets for modern slavery, particularly high-risk commodities, particularly high-risk products and services, parts of the world. But they're the kind of products and services and commodities that find their way into most companies' supply chains. So of those 21 million, the figures are 3.5 million people trapped in slave labor in agriculture, forestry, and fishing, and another 7.1 million people trapped in slave labor in construction, mining, manufacturing, and utilities. Some of the photos, one of them is about tomato pickers in Italy, or cotton pickers in Uzbekistan. So, you know, food makes its way into a lot of companies' supply chain, so does clothing. Where's that coming from? Who's working on the building site that your company is having something to do with? Who's working in the factories that you're sourcing your products from? Or who's doing your cleaning? The companies, well, they're not companies, the organizations that are organizing this slave labor are criminal organizations. They're very well organized, and they're very good at hiding what they do. So there's a very high chance that this could be in your supply chain, and you have absolutely no idea about it. Myth number 5. Modern slavery isn't something I need to do anything about. So you're following me on my journey. It's a really bad thing. It might even be in my company, but I'm a business leader. I've got so many things to do. I've got so many pressures on me, so many demands on my time, so many people expecting so many different deliverables from me. Trying to do something about this is not going to help with any of the other things I've got to do. Realistically, am I going to be able to prioritize trying to do something about this? So what I'd say about this myth is 2 things. The first, which is a bit like what Trudy was just saying in the introduction, slavery is a story of human suffering, and we're all human beings, and part of being human is about caring about the suffering of others. So there is just a moral response to this. It's one thing to not be aware of the problem, but once you are aware of this problem and that it could be an issue for your company, then it's very difficult, I think, as a human being to just ignore it. So that's one thing. But the second part of the response is that it's almost certainly something that your customers care something about. And being on the wrong end of a modern slavery story is not a place you want to be. So this brings me to myth number 6, which is that modern slavery isn't something that I can do anything about. And this is where I want to draw on the research we were doing and the conversations we were having with the different companies about what they were doing. You might have got to the point as a business leader where you're thinking, okay, I'm really persuaded that this is something I do have to do something about, but can I do anything about it? We're talking about really complicated, global, interconnected forces, economic forces, migration, criminal organizations. Am I really able to do something about that as just one company? So the answer we got from these companies we talked to was that there were quite a lot of things they were trying to do, and they were learning something about what was more effective than other things. We've got a really long 72-page report with some really detailed case studies in it. If anyone's interested, there's a few copies outside. I'm just going to try and pick out 3 short key messages from that whole monster of a piece of work. So number 1, know your supply chain and work with them. This might sound really obvious, and I think it's a fair assumption, isn't it, that most companies would know their supply chains. One of the people we spoke to in one of the research interviews we did told us this story about how he was in a job interview for a major North American retailer and to work on these kinds of things. And one of the questions he asked in the interview was, so how many suppliers have you got? And the answer he got from the person interviewing him was, we have no idea. That's the reason we want to hire you. That was a few years ago, and companies have got better about understanding their supply chain since then. But don't take it for granted that a company will have a clear idea at any one time who's in their supply chain. So the first sort of things you've got to do to work on modern slavery are to Create the systems that, it's boring stuff, but create the systems that give you a really clear idea, a really accurate idea at any one point in time who's supplying you. But then, you don't just need to know who's supplying you, you need to know who's supplying them, and who's supplying them, and who's supplying them, and go all the way down the supply chain. Because 9 times out of 10, the issues to do with modern slavery are going to be down at tiers 4 and 5. And the only way that you as a company can do anything about that is by working in partnership with the people you're buying things from. Number 2, the second thing you can do. You don't just need to work with your suppliers. You're going to need to work in partnership with some other more unconventional kinds of organizations to partner with. A lot of the companies we spoke to talked about needing to partner with their competitors. That was a pretty unusual thing for many of them, something that didn't come naturally, something they found quite hard to do culturally, especially when they were trying to talk to more senior managers in the organization. You're talking to who? Also, you need to talk to NGOs. That's the sort of thing that people would have talked about as being quite unconventional a few years ago. It's becoming more common. The one that really surprised me when people started talking about it was needing to work with unions. Now, kind of almost by definition, the relationship between companies and unions, by design, is supposed to be a relationship of conflict. So it's really weird to hear stories of companies seeking out partnerships with unions. But that's exactly the sort of thing we heard about. One of the stories that I can tell is about the city of Leicester in the UK. It's a city in the East Midlands. It's a centre for textile manufacturing in the UK. And there's been quite a few concerns about modern slavery in this city. And there was one company that we were talking to who was saying, well, we've got a lot of suppliers who are based in that city. We're hearing this stuff about problems in that city, but our suppliers are telling us everything's fine. But how can we be confident in that? There must be some problems, right? Why aren't our suppliers talking to us about that? But we, as a big company, we can't really go and try and talk to the workers in those factories. They're not going to talk to us. They're not going to feel confident enough to share any meaningful information to us. So what the company decided to do was seek out a small local union and said to their suppliers, you're only going to be able to carry on supplying us if you give access to this union to go and talk to your workers and let them find out an accurate description of what's going on in your workplaces. And that's what happened, and it enabled the company then form a view about whether there were any problems and whether they need to do anything about it. Third thing companies are doing, call for more government action. This is another stereotype. It's a real stereotype that business, no matter what kind of energy it's got for doing good things in the world, it doesn't tend to like government telling it to do something it doesn't already want to do. Pretty allergic to government intervention. It's a widely held view. It's certainly a very strongly held view in government. A lot of the policymakers that I've worked with in this research project and others, they're absolutely terrified of trying to do anything in terms of public policy that might cause businesses to turn around and say, to start jumping up and down and complaining and saying, you're adding cost to my business, you're going to make us uncompetitive. But the companies we were talking to about this issue were saying, well, actually, we've got all these problems with modern slavery. There's things that can be done to fix those problems, but actually government is best placed to make that happen. There's things government can do that no one else can do. We need that kind of help from government. And an example would be the UK Modern Slavery Act, which came into force in 2015. And a lot of the companies that we were calling for, we were speaking to, had actually been lobbying the British government pretty hard to make this piece of legislation as ambitious as it could be. There was a particular clause that they called for, which got included in the end, which was a requirement for all companies over a pretty low threshold to make a public statement on an annual basis about what they were doing about modern slavery. So that got included, and it's having a big impact. That's another thing that we found from the research. This kind of government intervention works. One part of the research we did was a survey, and one of the figures that came back was that CEO engagement within companies on modern slavery had doubled in the first year after this act was brought into force. Now, this is great news for these companies that have got a problem, because the more critical mass there is in the group of companies that are trying to do something about it, the more likely it is the problem is going to be solved, and also the burden is going to be shared more fairly. So this is a great example of companies saying, we need government to help us solve our problems, and it actually working. So this is the third thing that we've heard from companies, call for more government action. So I think that's more or less what I wanted to say about what you need to know about modern slavery, what other companies are doing, and what that means for what you can and should be thinking about in your company. Thanks very much.